In the spring of 2014, a farmer from Nebraska, Walter Hadley, found himself at the perimeter of a parcel of land that had consistently disappointed him for 4 consecutive years. The earth was parched and fissured, crop yields diminished steadily, and the bank's inquiries grew more persistent. For 3 generations, the Hadley lineage had drawn sustenance from this very soil. Now, Walter watched it deteriorate beneath his feet. Consequently, he embarked on a course of action that his neighbors deemed utterly irrational. He ceased his adversarial approach towards the land. He discontinued its chemical treatment, halted its aggressive tilling, and abandoned the pursuit of forcing it into production according to his rigid timetable. Instead, he entrusted the management of nearly the entire agricultural operation to a flock of sheep. Fast forward 8 years. The same fields that once resembled a desolate dust bowl are now fertile, yielding, and vibrant. Soil scientists from 3 distinct academic institutions are journeying to this location specifically to investigate the ongoing biological processes beneath the turf. Rainwater, which previously cascaded rapidly off the terrain during downpours, now permeates the ground like a porous material. Avian species that had been absent from this estate for decades are once again establishing their nests. And the agriculturalists who once derided Walter Hadley are now making visits to inquire about his methods. None of this occurred by chance, nor did it unfold in a manner that one might anticipate. However, the narrative behind this remarkable outcome is even more extraordinary. If tales of nature's recuperation resonate with you, we encourage you to subscribe and join us for further accounts of astonishing resurrections. And before we commence, kindly share your viewing location in the comments section. Let us ascertain the global reach of this narrative. Walter Hadley was raised on this very acreage. His paternal grandfather initiated cultivation of the virgin prairie in the 1950s. His father expanded the operation in the 70s, capitalizing on the trend of larger machinery and amplified assurances. By the time Walter assumed control in his early 30s, the established strategy appeared straightforward: increase planting, intensify chemical application, and exert greater pressure on the soil with each passing season. For a period, this approach yielded results. Subsequently, it faltered. Crop yields began to decline in the early 2000s, not precipitously, but with a gradual reduction in corn output annually. An escalating demand for fertilizer was required to maintain previous levels of productivity. A growing reliance on debt was necessary to bridge the financial disparity. Walter rationalized these setbacks as attributable to meteorological conditions, market fluctuations, or misfortune. However, beneath the surface, a different phenomenon was occurring. The very composition of the soil was degrading, akin to an engine deprived of lubrication. By 2013, Walter was routinely waking at 4 in the morning to confront financial calculations that consistently failed to add up. He had a spouse, 2 offspring, and a mortgage on land that his own family had once possessed free and clear. Divesting himself of it felt like a profound dereliction of duty. Continuing as he was felt akin to professional annihilation. This was not an idealistic aspiration to reconnect with the natural world. It was a man confronting a ledger that indicated he had approximately 2 years remaining before the financial institution would make the disposition of his property. The majority of farmers would have relinquished their land, but he chose an entirely divergent trajectory. It commenced with a podcast Walter listened to intermittently while loading grain into a silo one evening. A rancher from South Dakota was discussing a practice known as regenerative grazing, which involved moving livestock across limited land areas in a concentrated, rapid rotation, followed by extended periods of rest for the ground. The underlying principle appeared deceptively uncomplicated. Animals graze intensely and swiftly, mirroring the behavior of wild herds that were historically kept in constant motion by predators. Following their departure, The grass, instead of being denuded completely, is afforded the opportunity to regenerate and develop more robust root systems. Their excrement and trampled vegetation serve as nourishment for countless microorganisms beneath the soil. Over time, this microscopic ecosystem revitalizes the very structure of the earth. Walter presented this concept at a local cooperative meeting. The reception was far from encouraging. One of his contemporaries asserted that sheep would be incapable of achieving what tractors and chemical interventions had failed to accomplish. Another jested that he was on the verge of becoming the shepherd of insolvency. Even his father, though retired, remained astute and cautioned him against risking his entire livelihood on what sounded like a passing trend. Experts offered little solace, at least initially. Mainstream agricultural soil science had for decades been fixated on external inputs: increased fertilizer, greater pesticide use, and more extensive irrigation. The notion that livestock, managed judiciously, could surpass the efficiency of machinery struck many as an antiquated viewpoint cloaked in novel terminology. However, Walter repeatedly returned to a single question that preoccupied his thoughts. Could sheep truly revitalize land that machinery and chemicals could not? In the spring of 2015, Walter acquired 40 ewes and a portable electric fencing system. He selected his least productive 40 acres, the section that was universally considered beyond redemption, and commenced his experiment there. He reasoned that if it proved unsuccessful, he would not have jeopardized his more valuable land. He ceased tilling that particular tract. He discontinued its chemical treatment. Instead, he strategically moved the sheep through this area in small enclosures, occasionally repositioning the fencing on a daily basis, thereby emulating the migratory patterns of wild herds across expansive grasslands. His neighbors anticipated a catastrophic outcome: overgrazing, barren pastures, perhaps even ailing animals. For the initial few months, their predictions seemed plausible. The ground still appeared unkempt. The grass still looked sparse. Walter spent many sleepless nights contemplating whether he had committed an error that could permanently jeopardize his family's farm. Initially, no discernible changes were apparent. Then, during the second growing season, subtle alterations began to manifest. Patches of clover started to emerge in areas that had previously been devoid of vegetation. The grass that did grow appeared denser, more verdant, and more resilient following periods of drought. It was not a dramatic improvement. It did not constitute definitive proof. However, it was sufficient to sustain Walter's resolve, and these nascent indicators would ultimately culminate in an outcome that defied everyone's expectations. By the third year, the metamorphosis was impossible to overlook. Indigenous grasses, which had not been observed on this property within living memory, began to reappear, seemingly emerging from nowhere. Walter discovered earthworms in quantities he had not witnessed since his childhood, assisting his grandfather in digging fence posts. The soil itself had undergone a color transformation, shifting from a pale, fatigued grayish-brown to a deep, almost black hue. This alteration held significant implications. Dark, friable soil is rich in organic matter, which essentially comprises the residual carbon from decomposed flora and microbial life. An increased volume of organic matter enhances the soil's capacity to retain moisture, functioning like a sponge rather than an impermeable barrier. It also signifies an augmented availability of nutrients for plants, obviating the necessity for synthetic fertilizers to artificially stimulate growth. The sheep were accomplishing something that machinery could not. Their hooves gently disturbed the soil's surface without causing compaction, unlike the effect of heavy equipment. Their manure provided nutrients through a gradual, sustained release, as opposed to a concentrated chemical application. And due to the fact that the grass was never grazed to its complete detriment, its root systems continued to penetrate deeper, sequestering carbon beneath the surface and anchoring the soil against erosion. Walter began to observe an increased presence of insects buzzing within the pastures, with more birds descending to feed upon them. For the first time in years, the land felt vibrant and alive rather than meticulously managed. But the most significant transformation was not occurring above ground. News of the Hadley farm's resurgence propagated through agricultural circles with unexpected rapidity. A soil scientist from the University of Nebraska initiated contact, driven by curiosity and requesting authorization to conduct tests on the property. Her findings proved surprising even to her. Within 2 years, 2 additional research teams from Iowa State and Kansas State arrived to perform their own independent analyses, drawn by the same compelling preliminary data. Soil carbon levels on the rotated pasture had significantly increased in comparison to adjacent, undisturbed sections. Microbial activity, essentially a metric of the living biological organisms present in the soil, was substantially elevated. Water infiltration assessments revealed that rainfall penetrated Walter's rejuvenated fields far more rapidly than his conventionally managed acreage, resulting in diminished runoff and reduced erosion during intense storms. The scientists were not present to commend Walter. Their objective was to measure, document, and comprehend. And the data their instruments recorded corroborated Walter's personal observations over the preceding 3 years. If such a recovery could occur on land universally deemed irredeemable, what implications would this hold for farms grappling with similar exhaustion worldwide? Bolstered by the validated data, Walter did not confine his efforts to 40 acres. Over subsequent seasons, he progressively extended the rotational grazing system to encompass additional fields, until sheep were managing virtually the entire farm, not merely the section that had been written off by all. The ensuing developments felt less like a singular solution and more like a cascading effect, with each element reinforcing the preceding one. Initially, the vegetation itself flourished, developing deeper roots and denser stands. Subsequently, insect populations surged, attracted by the diverse flora now thriving in the pasture. Birds followed the insects, returning in numbers that Walter had not witnessed since his youth to establish their nests. Pollinators arrived next, drawn by clover and wildflowers that had emerged from soil previously too depleted to support them. Nearby water sources improved as runoff decelerated, and filtration through healthier soil reduced sediment and nutrient contamination. And finally, almost as a secondary consequence of all these positive changes, the farm regained its profitability. Each improvement fueled the next. None of these outcomes were part of the initial plan. They were simply the natural results of providing a damaged ecosystem with the conditions necessary for its own repair. A persistent misconception within agricultural communities posits that land restoration and financial viability are mutually exclusive objectives. It suggests a dichotomy where one either prioritizes ecological well-being or economic gain, but never both. Walter's financial records told a different story. His expenditure on fertilizer decreased by more than half within 4 years, as a consequence of healthier soil naturally supplying essential nutrients. His sheep, grazing on a varied and nutrient-rich pasture, required less supplementary feed and maintained better health, thereby reducing veterinary expenses. His land also demonstrated increased resilience during arid periods, effectively absorbing and retaining moisture that would have otherwise evaporated or run off. Profitability did not materialize through a singular dramatic windfall. It accrued through numerous incremental cost reductions, coupled with a flock and a tract of land that finally operated in synergy rather than in opposition. The same neighbors who had once jested about the shepherd of bankruptcy began to visit, seeking to understand his success. They observed their own input costs escalating each season, while Walter's continued to decline. For Walter, the lesson was straightforward. Healing the land and achieving financial prosperity were not competing aspirations. They had, in fact, been the same objective all along. Walter's narrative is not fundamentally about sheep, fencing, or academic soil analyses. It is about a question that modern agriculture has been evading for decades. What transpires when we cease striving to dominate the land and instead endeavor to comprehend it? The Japanese farmer and philosopher Masanobu Fukuoka eloquently stated, "The ultimate goal of farming is not the growing of crops, but the cultivation and perfection of human beings." Walter had not encountered these words prior to commencing his new approach, but somewhere along his journey, his own thinking arrived at a remarkably similar conclusion. Healthy soil is not merely an environmental talking point. It is the foundational element underpinning food security, the source of clean water, and the bedrock upon which whatever future the next generation of farmers inherits is built. Land capable of retaining water, supporting insect life, and regenerating itself following periods of stress is not a luxury. It represents the crucial distinction between a farm that can weather the next drought and one that cannot. Visualize that same field from the outset of this account, cracked, barren, and depleted, with Walter standing at its edge, contemplating his dwindling options. Now, picture it today: dark soil, lush vegetation, and sheep grazing in slow, deliberate rotations across ground once considered lifeless. The land did not require greater force. It did not necessitate another application of chemicals or another expensive piece of machinery. It simply needed time and the opportunity to perform what it had always inherently known how to do. Sometimes, the most effective solution is not to exert more control over nature, but rather to understand it more profoundly. If this narrative has altered your perspective on agriculture, please share it with someone who cherishes the land. And tell us in the comments, could methods like these benefit farms in your country?